for the panel.
Thank you. I thank the chairman. A couple questions on the substance of the proposal, but first I want to talk a bit about process. So grateful to have each of the witnesses here from the various committees of jurisdiction. I must say I'm a bit struck by some of the comments that have been made both by the witnesses and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. In a normal negotiation, one would expect that a party that had just successfully negotiated an agreement with another party would be proud of that negotiated product, might be a bit magnanimous, might concede that both parties in the negotiation were able to get something out of the deal and ultimately are committed to moving forward for the benefit of the American people, with the exception of perhaps Mr. Estes. And so I'm not going to include him in this broad brush because I think his remarks are a bit more tempered. I have yet to see any of that from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. It strikes me the only person who's being magnanimous about any of this is President Biden, who has taken that approach during the pendency of these negotiations. Why are we here at this hour? Because Republicans have brought us to the brink of a potential default, the first in our country's history. And as the chairman, or the former chairman, our ranking member, so eloquently noted in the beginning, this is a manufactured crisis. No question about it. House Republicans are in control. You have the gavels. You are in the majority. And the fact that we are now a mere few days from a potential default because the majority has decided to engage in this hostage-taking that my colleagues have described, I think, is a dangerous harbinger for how this body may function into the future. Now, I heard a number of my colleagues, and I was a bit surprised to hear the chairman use some of these phrases, sort of laying blame at the president and describe, I think he used the word dithering and long delays. I hope we can certainly disabuse the American public of any of these exaggerations and, in my view, falsehoods around the nature of the negotiations that have taken place. The president put forward a budget months ago. Mr. Chairman, Chairman Smith, do you know when the president submitted his budget to the United States Congress?
I don't remember, but it was
March 9th.
It was late. It was due February 1st.
Oh, I'm glad you noted that. Chairman Smith, when did the Republicans submit their budget?
You would need to ask the budget.
I would need to ask the budget chair. Well, Mr. Estes, when did the Republicans submit their budget? Only in the Rules Committee, by the way, could a witness lay blame at the president for being a few weeks late in submitting his budget when his party hasn't submitted a budget, period. I don't know if I'm living in the twilight zone. I mean, again, I'm not suggesting that, that one cannot make points, substantive points, and have reasonable disagreement about the merits of the underlying proposal. But what I take issue with is this kind of constant scorched earth mentality of, again, laying blame at the White House at every turn, notwithstanding that this is a deal that your party has negotiated with the White House. Republicans didn't submit a budget. They filed their bill, the Default on America Act. I understand you have a different name for it. Chairman Smith, when was that bill filed?
I don't know what you mean, the Default America
The Save,
Act.
Limit, Grow Act, when was that submitted to the Congress?
Oh, that's clearly not the bill that you were just talking about. The Limit, Save, Grow Act was passed out of Congress in April.
April 25th is when it was introduced. So the president puts forward his budget in early March. He tells House Republicans and Speaker McCarthy, put forward your budget, put forward your proposal, and let's have a conversation.
A budget is
Mr.
not a
Smith,
debt limiting.
It's
two different
I'm going to claim my time, and you'll have an opportunity to respond at the end. The president submits the budget, gives Republicans an opportunity. Republicans don't file it. Mid-March, late March, early April, the House adjourns for a 2-week break. Mid-April, still nothing. Finally, House Republicans introduce their bill, not a budget, blueprint, but a bill. They pass it that same week, and then the House adjourns for another recess. The day the House comes back, the president brings forth the Speaker, the Senate leadership, and the Minority Leader of the House to have a conversation about resolving the impasse. So again, facts are facts. Obviously, we're going to have disagreements about the propriety of the spending cuts or revenue decisions with respect to the underlying bill that's being proposed today. But let us dispense with the blame around delays that, unfortunately, my colleagues have been so stuck on. Now, Ranking Member Boyle, you said something that I thought was important for folks who are tuning in, and of course, usually we don't have this much media in the Rules Committee. It's often we don't have these kinds of interesting hearings, and I suppose, again, it's because the stakes are so high. But this is not the first time that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have decided to engage in this kind of hostage-taking. We were here, not you and I, but the Congress was here, the American people were here a decade ago when they did this previously. And I guess I wonder if you might expound a bit on what this type of hostage-taking suggests may be in our future to the extent that it continues to happen.
Yeah, Mr. Neguse, that is correct. In the summer of 2011, unlike any other period, even though the debt limit itself has existed since World War I, and even in its modern form since the late 1930s, really 2011 was a milestone, because that's the first time in the history of the debt ceiling we saw one party weaponize it to such a degree. It roiled the markets. They dropped, I believe, 17%, including 5% in one day. And even though the debt ceiling was ultimately raised, by coming within just a few days of deadline, it led to the first ever downgrade in American history. Downgrade was done by Standard & Poor's. GAO has subsequently found it has increased our borrowing costs by billions of dollars. So after all of that turmoil and after all of that tumult, it actually ended up increasing the national debt and increasing the cost to taxpayers. It also created a dangerous precedent that now this Republican majority, again with a House Republican majority and a Democrat in the White House, they decided to follow that 2011 game plan. So we had been put on warning by at least one credit agency that we may face another downgrade. You know, the reality is, the more this goes on and the more this goes on, first, as I mentioned before, we tempt fate that we will actually go over the cliff and bring the global economy with it. But we also run the risk that we will one day not be the reserve currency of the world. The reason why our interest rates are so low comparatively is because we are a safe haven for investment for the rest of the world. These sort of antics increasingly bring that into doubt, whether or not folks will get their money, the folks who are lending to us. So this is it's a dangerous pattern that was really created in 2011. This has been another major milestone when it comes to the debt ceiling. And I'm truly worried in terms of what the future looks like if we don't dramatically change this system.
Well, I thank the ranking member. I share your sentiments, and I think one benefit of this legislation, to President Biden's credit, is that it takes this kind of hostage-taking off of the table for the duration of the 118th Congress by virtue of the limit being extended through January of 2025. But nonetheless, this isn't sustainable. And Ranking Member McGovern's warnings, I think, are prescient. And I would challenge my Republican colleagues to recognize those warnings, to be cognizant of that, because clearly if this becomes the precedent, irrespective of which party might be in power in Washington or the political affiliation of the president at a given time, to the extent the debt ceiling is up, it will incentivize this kind of hostage-taking into the future. Now, in terms of the substance of the proposal, again, I'll perhaps go to you, Chairman Smith, because I think, again, Mr. Estes, you described a variety of the different provisions in the bill, at least some of those, in ways that I think are consistent with the underlying language of the bill. And this bill is not perfect by any stretch. There are a variety of provisions that I certainly disagree with. But I do think the bill, on balance, does a number of things. One, it averts catastrophic default. As Ranking Member Boyle articulated, the consequences of a default on our debt would be devastating to everyday Americans across our country, in Kansas and Colorado, everywhere. Two, it, as I said, takes the hostage-taking off of the table for the duration of this Congress. And then finally, it protects core American programs for a lot of Americans. Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, programs that House Democrats have been fighting to protect and have successfully protected over the course of these last 30 days, evident by the bill that we have before us. I was a bit surprised, Chairman Smith, when our chairman, Chairman Cole, asked the question of you to essentially describe the parallels, or this wrong phrase, similarities between the limit, your April bill, I'm forgetting the phraseology here, Save, Grow, Limit bill that you all introduced in April, and this bill. And your response was, I wrote it down because I was so struck by it. You said, you can go, quote, line by line. I've spent the last couple of days reviewing this bill since the legislative text was released. So I have done that. I suspect many of my colleagues have as well. And what I see certainly doesn't comport with the bill that was passed back in April. Medicaid. This agreement doesn't include any changes to the work requirements for Medicaid, which your bill, the April bill, did. As we know, it would ultimately put at risk 21 million Americans in terms of potentially losing Medicaid. This bill does not do that. This bill, as you said, includes a rescission of IRS funding, and Ranking Member Designee Thompson explained this as well, of $1.4 billion. My read of the April bill that you had proposed was a $180 billion rescission. Am I using the right number, or is that incorrect?
180 billion, more like 72 billion.
72 billion. Okay, so $1.4 billion versus $72 billion. Those two numbers don't strike me as similar. I mean, if you were going to ask me and say, are these two numbers similar, I would say no. But anyway, we can go down the list line by line. Fully funding veterans' medical care. We call it, the Default America Act, cut $200 million for VA research, $1.2 billion for VA technical research. This bill fully funds medical care for veterans, including the funding, as Ranking Member Boyle said, for the PACT Act's Toxic Exposure Fund at the levels that were included in the President's fiscal year 2024 budget. SNAP eligibility. This bill includes SNAP eligibility for veterans, for those who are homeless, a variety of different vulnerable people, understanding the change that you articulated in your colloquy with Mr. Cole, with Chairman Cole. But in addition to those changes you described, and I'm not taking issue with, well, I take issue perhaps substantively with them, I'm not taking issue with your description of them, but I am simply saying alongside those, adjacent to those, there is the reality that this bill does in fact expand SNAP for certain veterans. And so I guess my point here, again, perhaps leaning on something that, or a theme, I suppose, that Mr. Thompson, Mr. Estes, and Mr. Boyle, I think all touched on, which is that this is a compromise measure. Not everybody got what they wanted. It's not perfect, but ultimately it will avert a disastrous default, and it protects core programs that are going to benefit a lot of Americans. And I was hopeful that that would be the enduring theme of this particular hearing, given that this is a bill that Speaker McCarthy and his party, ostensibly, or at least on his party's behalf, negotiated with the president. And it's unfortunate that it hasn't been the tone, but nonetheless, we'll do my best to try to bring that to bear here. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for any questions she might have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And